So I want you to imagine this issue of as a continuum. So on one side of your continuum you have the robust small town, and say Elwood is that kind of town, right? Now, I'm not quite sure if it is, but there it is, and it's well kept. It's got a good solid tax base. It's got a lot of kids there keeping the schools open. There are jobs there for people who stay there, and it's a good place to raise a family, right? And then on the other extreme, you have what we call the hollowed out town. And I couldn't quite sort of dredge up an example from Indiana on my short trip today, but I'll give you one. Colby, Kansas. And this is a place where the town itself died a long time ago. And, it's funny, the town, the sort of little downtown area is, almost all boarded up. And you have this truck stop area, because it's on one of the interstates that goes through Kansas, that's doing quite well, but it's just people passing through, So it's not really a place that has a lot of kids. The school is still open there, but only just. And a master's student got in touch with me just soon after she'd read our book when it came out. And she said, I was doing a project on Colby, and I sat there in the downtown area outside the bank on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks before Christmas. And she said between 2 and 5 p.m. she saw 4 people. And she said it was eerie because the bank had this piped Christmas music that was coming out, and it was sort of echoing off these empty streets. And it was, she said like the Twilight Zone in some ways, right? That it was this. So I think, those are sort of examples of extremes, right? And the hollowed out place that's, finally, its final death knell in many ways is when they no longer have children to keep a school open. Okay, so what are some of the reasons for this, and how did we get to where we are today? Well, there are some very, very big or macro reasons why we did. So we talk about the demographic changes that have swept non-metropolitan or small-town America. So between 1980 and 2000, a little over 700 rural counties lost 10% or more of their population. Okay, that may not seem like a lot until you look sort of behind that figure and you see who's leaving. The who is the young and the educated. Okay, and that's really what's driving that population loss. Okay, at the same time, you have between 2000 and 2005, 640 odd. Very many of the same counties that lost population between 1980 and 2000, these same places had more deaths than births, so a natural decrease in population. Okay, so when you talk about fertility rates or whatever, you have countries who have more that don't have a replacement for the population and so on. But when you have it at a small town, it's severely debilitating because remember that key institution keeping the school open. If you're not having kids been born there, you're really heading for trouble 5-6 years down the road. And the second thing that it does is that it pushes the average or even the median age upwards. So the town where we did our work in Ellis, Iowa, and Ellis is a pseudonym, the median age rose almost by 10 in a 30-year span, and that's a very, very big increase. So, again, young people leaving, the town is getting older, the tax base is getting smaller, the needs that you have are getting greater. The healthcare needs, for instance, of an older population. Another trend that we see in non-metro America is that many of these places are in what we call medically underserved areas. So non-metropolitan America, so take a look at Iowa as just an example, and that's the one where we did our work. Over 46%, and I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but over almost half of all the non-metro counties had at least 2 medically underserved areas where there's no doctor, there's no dentist, there's no nursing assistant, that you have to travel sometimes long distances to see a primary care physician. Okay, so you can see how these things are sort of coming together. At the same time as you have these sort of demographic dilemmas, you have these changes, these other larger scale changes in the two bellwethers of metropolitan America, the two bellwethers of small town America that always were, and that's agriculture and industry. So the changes in agriculture that predate the farm crisis in the 80s, going back to the 60s, where you began to see excuse me, larger scale mechanization, a move of people away from the land because it just weren't needed, right? It wasn't labor intensive anymore when you could use combine harvesters and other machinery that would do the work of 10 or 20 people. And since the farm crisis, what we've seen is this sustained corporatization, if you like, of agriculture. So the average farm size in the county where we did our work grew threefold. The average farm size grew threefold in 20 years. And it was, if you see the pattern, because you can see it broken down as to the sizes of these farms, it's the large farms gobbling up all the smaller ones. Now, in many cases, it's not the owners of these large farms, or it's usually the median case is when one of the big agricultural companies, Monsanto or whomever, Archer Daniels Midland, will buy the large farmer out, buy these old smaller lots, amalgamate them into this mega lot, and then lease it back to the person they bought the original lot off. It's like a form of 21st century sharecropping, where the bigger companies own the land and the stake and so on, and then that the person farms it because they know how to and they know the vagaries of the local landscape and so on, using of course the seed and products that are provided by their overlords, and so the bigger companies then win. But what you're seeing is this push towards these larger mega farms, towards a very monocultural farming. Not that it wasn't going there anyway, it's been going there since the 70s, but it really puts the cap on it. And a much less labor-intensive agriculture. You see people moving away from agriculture. Less than 2% of the American workforce works in a broad sort of agricultural sense. That would also include food processing. So you can kind of see how that has diminished over time. And with industry, manufacturing especially, the story of manufacturing is well known. We have been shedding manufacturing jobs really since the 70s. We have periods where we shed lots of them, and it's pretty much the same in rural America. There are some stories that some of our guys in Ellis tell us about, the great job to get, the great industrial job in that area for decades was to drive almost 100 miles each way to John Deere. And the John Deere job was that was the best job you could ever get. And usually then there would be grandfathers, fathers, and they'd pull their sons into it and so on. Now these guys, this generation that we spoke with, talked about how, well, I did get a start at John Deere, but I'm earning nothing like my father or my grandfather earned, like in real terms, and I don't have any benefits, and I'm on a contract where I can be sacked at any time, laid off periodically, and then rehired as a temp worker with even less in the way of wages and benefits. So what we're very solid and sustaining blue-collar jobs, have all but disappeared. Okay, so these are just some of the broad sort of issues. So we were charged with studying young adults in rural America, and we were, initially really sent out to find out what is it like to grow up in small town America, from the vantage point of you being in your 20s, being an adult or almost an adult. And what we found very early on when we asked some of these questions was that for almost everybody we spoke with, it boiled down to two basic questions. When you come of age, you leave high school, whatever, and as, do I stay or do I go? And number two, if I go, do I ever come back? And that what we found was then that the young people we spoke with mapped themselves onto pathways based on how they answered those two questions. Okay? So these pathways, I'm going to go briefly through them, and we'll see how now with this sort of background of stuff that has changed fundamentally in these places, see how these pathways map onto that, right? So we had levers, and we had two types of levers. We had, firstly, the achievers. And these were the young people who, in many ways, got all the breaks. They were the first chair in the orchestra, National Honor Society. They were primed and cultivated and mentored and got all, the lion's share of both the educational resources and the wider community resources. I'll give you a couple of for instances. So one young woman who was a valedictorian, when we ended up interviewing her, she's 25, 26, living in Kansas City, very, very successful. She said, well, growing up, I always felt I was different, and people told me that I was different and that I was special. And she says, I quote, I felt I was being sent forth to do great things. Okay, so that was how she explained it. Another young woman told us how, she very much felt growing up that she had the town at her back, right? That everybody was pulling for her. And to a person, these achievers were encouraged to leave to succeed. Okay? So let's put them there. So these, and in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, these are the most academically talented, these are the most educated, and these are the ones who are, very much behind this rural population loss, right? These are the smart kids, educated and so forth, that are been, if not pushed out, accelerated to leave, right? We have another group of leavers, a group of leavers for whom the desire to leave is very, very strong, but the mentorship, the concerted cultivation is very weak. They're not singled out for special help or resources. The community is not pulling for them and so on. We call them the seekers. And though this isn't the case in the life of every seeker, but the vast majority, I'd say 80 to 85% of our seekers, did what many, many young people from small town America have done for generations and continue to do so. Take a look at the figures that we have right now, and that is join the armed forces. Okay? Army, Navy, so on. And this was their way out. And recruiters know this. Recruiters are thick on the ground, or as thick on the ground as hay is in the fall of senior year in Ellis High School. We got to sit in on a couple of conversations that a National Guard recruit had. Some of it's mentioned in the book. And these guys are they're easy. This is a volunteer army. Now in a time of war, they've been offered signing on bonuses in terms of money. They've been offered money for college after they serve their time, and so on. It's very, very attractive for those who want to leave. However, and this is one of the things that really sticks in my craw about these young people, that we all, academics and politicians, everybody wants to say, oh, we're so delighted for your service and we really value it, and we pay a lot of lip service to it. And one of the things that gets me is that they're told before they go in, oh yeah, anything you do will be useful to getting into college, and you can sometimes get your credit for whatever, and so on. So we had one young woman who was 9 years a naval nurse. She was so good at her job, she ended up being the instructor up on